This is the Open University.
A sense of stumbling, a sense of an impasse. How might that be something good and something creative and even important for us to encounter? I want to talk today about something called aporia. Aporia, which is used in some senses as a kind of an impasse, a word for impasse, impossibility, undecidability. Oh God, it's such a big topic. But I want to start with something quite concrete, which is that on Twitter this morning was a weekly challenge from a psychotherapist who said, for my gender exploratory training course, who were your favorite GNC artists as you grew up? And I had to look up what did this mean, GNC. It means gender non-conforming. And somebody said Mark Armand, Annie Lennox, Sinead O'Connor, Alison Moyer, Grace Jones, Momus, Lena Lovitch, and David Bowie. I would call those it's more like a queer kind of subset there. But apparently this is gender non-conforming, presumably because, Sinead O'Connor shaved her head, Grace Jones also had a kind of very mannish look. And Lena Lovitch, I'm not sure, because she was famous for having screamed making horror film soundtracks in the 70s and then becoming a kind of kooky new wave singer. Bowie, spurred on largely by his wife, I think, in the 70s, when he famously gave this Grammy Awards presentation in, I think, 1975, he came on and said,
ladies and gentlemen, and others.
Did that imply, extraterrestrials? It could well have done, or it could have implied gender extra, that there were other genders out there. So he was gender non-conforming in his look very much, but also in his kind of view of the world. Later, though, I think he became, 1983, David Bowie Straight, Rolling Stone magazine, sort of became gender conforming. And then everything went to rack and ruin in his career from that point on. So perhaps it was a bad choice. I'm happy to be grouped with Mark Armand and people like that. Well, obviously, I have Jacques Brel in common with Mark Armand. But, I wouldn't immediately think of myself as gender non-conforming. But just as I had that thought, I was thinking to myself, well, maybe I'm more like sportswear non-conforming in terms of the way I dress. Then I thought, wait, I'm dressed entirely in women's clothes. I mean, these trousers are Japanese trousers, mostly for women. This shirt has padded shoulders. So, in fact, what I'm doing is I'm dressing in women's clothes, not just women's clothes, but women's clothes from the 80s, which was a time, a weird time full of contradictions in which women were meant to be empowered by wearing padded shoulders. What does it mean to wear padded shoulders, except that if you have a rather slight body like mine, you look more like a muscle man. It's meant to be a stereotypically male profile. So there was something a bit strange about the idea of dressing like a woman who is dressing like a man. But in terms of dress, I would say I'm more just non-conforming in general. I don't think it's gender non-conforming specifically, and that makes me think, why is that the only important thing for some people, some therapists perhaps, to be gender non-conforming? Why not be non-conforming in other ways? And this reminds me of a question I asked in a talk from about 3 or 4 years ago when I was thinking about elective affinities, which was a term I borrowed from Goethe. The elective affinity, and I'm thinking in terms of families, the first family is the one we don't have the choice over. It's not elective. You're born into the family you're born into. There's nothing you can do about it. Your second family, the one you found, presumably, if you're hetero, gender conforming or not, you do have the choice of your partner, at least in the romantic ideology of individualism of the West. We don't have arranged marriages and things, so we have the choice of who to marry and who to found the second family with, and that is the elective affinity. So I was thinking in terms of non-elective and elective affinities, and I asked this question, why, in terms of 2016, which was when I was doing this talk, why was all the emphasis on non-elective affinities, in other words, blood and soil, ancestral roots, race, things which you don't have a choice over. The thing that puzzled me was why were borders suddenly so important? I mean, this was in the wake of the Brexit decision. Suddenly Britain was going to put up borders, and these borders were going to ensure some kind of amazing freedom and wealth and prosperity and whatever. I thought, why is it really going back to this blood and soil thing? Because we had also, there's a guy called David Goodhart who was talking about the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres were people who were rooted in blood and soil, presumably, who came from somewhere identifiable, who exemplified the way of thinking of that place, versus the anywheres who were these globalized, nomadic people, intellectuals, cosmopolitans, people like me, in other words. We were being attacked on all sides. People identified us with bankers, with international finance, with the Jews more, surreptitiously, or with sort of immigrants like Muslims coming into Britain and taking the jobs apparently from British workers and all the rest of it. So I very strongly came out on side of the anywheres, and to me the whole point of being an anywhere, being an exile or being an expatriate or an emigrant or whatever term you want to use, is that it's elective. You choose where to live, why to live there, what your affinities are with the people you've chosen to lodge with, as it were. And it doesn't matter. Those things which are predetermined, your point of origin, stops mattering so much. So it occurred to me today, walking down the street, that the reason suddenly, after the Brexit debates and everything, and the end of the global era, which we continue to witness, I mean, COVID has really put the last nails in the coffin of the global era. If Brexit and isolationism, the Trump model of the US's new role of being isolated and putting walls around it, walls, borders, all the rest of it. The reason that has all come to an end is that I suppose part of that whole process was it's how you reward people who have never actually chosen to leave where they're from, to leave the people they were born with, to uproot themselves and reroute themselves and make a conscious effort to change their lives. So it actually rewards a lack of initiative or a lack of gumption, a lack of responsibility for one's own life choices and life results. So, the existentialist part of me was very unsatisfied with that these people were getting rewarded for never actually having travelled, never actually having enlarged their perspectives, simply for having come from where they come from. There's a sort of tautological logic in this. Brexit equals Brexit. I come from where I come from. I am who I am. It doesn't go anywhere. It's a dog chasing its own tail. Why don't you change the I and change the place and change the animal that you think you are to something else? It's fun for a start. You have to be creative though, and you have to be constructive, and you have to make some decisions and go through with them. But I've never really understood why it was only borders and origins that were suddenly important at that point. Obviously political reasons. It was obviously to do with a significant proportion of the population feeling that globalization had not served them, and that they didn't like this global world and that this was benefiting the rich. The problem is that pretty much any arrangement of things benefits the powerful and the rich. So globalization, I think, was a scapegoat in that case. I certainly benefited enormously from it and enjoyed enormously being a tourist and stretching the definition of what a tourist is for many decades of my life. The unventuresome and the uncurious are rewarded for having never done or said anything remotely adventurous or risky. Milton made a really interesting pamphlet called Areopagitica, which is about the Cromwell government in Britain deciding or thinking about, debating whether to censor books, whether they were going to read every single book published in England and decide whether it was good for the regime or bad for the regime, and whether it could therefore go ahead into publication or not. And Milton, being a good Protestant Christian, said that virtue did not consist in never being tempted. You didn't make people better morally or ethically by removing dangerous ideas. You put all the dangerous ideas out there, and then you you judge someone's virtue by how well they've resisted those bad and dirty ideas, or dangerous and subversive ideas. Publishing is essential, and you must be free in what you're allowed to publish. And also, it is a Christian idea that sin is... Christians are quite sympathetic to sin in general, and you see this in the Bible, you see this in what Christ said, that there's much more rejoicing in heaven when a sinner comes in from the cold back into the fold. Or the Confessions of St. Augustine, where you get this guy, very interesting book about how all the terrible, sinful things he did when he was young, and then he repented and capitulated to the Christian life of ethics, or Kierkegaard's Either Or, where he talks about the young man, the journal of a seducer, the diary of a seducer, followed by the ethical state of marriage, which, Kierkegaard himself didn't really live long enough to experience, but he had as an ideal that there were these two halves in life, where you do all the bad stuff and you get it out of your system, you sow your wild oats, and then you become ethical by having sort of built up a resistance to evil and sin. And that's, it's dealt with differently in different parts of Christianity. The Catholics confess and sort of have a little kind of pus squeezing session with their priest, in which all the evil drips out and it doesn't build up into a boil. What a horrible metaphor. So this is where I started thinking about aporia and Derrida. There's very interesting ideas about undecidability and aporia. Aporia in rhetoric always meant something which a writer pretending he didn't know something, or was mystified by something, or making a contradiction deliberately to interest the readers and to sort of chew something out a little bit more deeply. So, but in Derrida, it goes back to Plato's Symposium, and Plato talked about Poros, who was this Greek god of plenitude, of plenty, and of resourcefulness, who mated with Penia. I think she was called Penia, the goddess of poverty. And they created, the love child they created was Eros, love. So love is the child of plenitude and poverty. So Poros becomes a symbol of plenitude, expediency, pursuit, abundance, pragmatism, passage, and connection. And aporia, the A on the beginning of that word, means the opposite of all those things. So he's a figure defining something by its opposite, as its opposite. Aporia is disconnection, inability to connect, impassibility, logical contradiction, a blind spot in someone's argument, something undecidable, a dead end. And yet, as Derrida says in one of his books, he's thinking about aporia, the ethics of aporia. He says you can't decide without coming to one of those dead ends. A dead end, it's path breaking happens when you come to a cul-de-sac. When you come to a dead end on a path, that's when you really have to think, where do I go next and how do I break a new path? So it's essentially a creative dead end. The famous one with Beckett on the end of the pier, looking out into the darkness of the loch in Ireland, and having his breakthrough that he needed to embrace minimalism and strip everything down. that's another breakthrough. But it very often creatively breakthroughs come from dead ends. So I think Derrida says something very interesting about decision. You cannot decide. An actual decision is not just applying a rule. It's advancing into the unknown, into what has not already been decided. So if you make a decision based on facts and knowledge and previous practice, those are all kind of things which disqualify it as a real decision. A real decision is a leap of faith, a jump into the unknown. And ethics and politics, according to Derrida, start with undecidability. When something is undecidable, it's an aporia. It seems to be contradictory, it seems to be messed up and tangled up in your mind, and you can't make a snap decision. You have to think about it and then make a personal choice that is, in a sense, blind. So Derrida likens it to walking and falling. And there's actually like a Laurie Anderson track called Walking and Falling. Maybe she got it from Derrida, I don't know. She was certainly reading Derrida. She says you're walking, but you're always falling. With every step you take, you're falling, and then catching yourself from falling, and then falling again. So that's some big science. one of my favorite, because it's very mesmeric, one of my favorite tracks on Big Science. And so Derrida says that this is, it is the condition of progress, of forward movement, of walking, that you allow yourself to fall. You allow yourself to make that kind of little leap of faith into the darkness, into the blindness, of not quite knowing what was the right decision to make. That is an actual decision. And he also says that it's the other in me that decides. It's not your ego and your knowledge that informs a decision. It's your internalization of another, of something less known. And maybe this relates to the relationship between Poros and Penia, that Penia was sort of deciding to seduce Poros and create Eros by acting more like Poros would, acting with decisiveness, with kind of apparently plenitude to seduce him. She was sort of internalizing what was associated with him. And this, so it kind of works against the grain of identity politics when you say that. When you say you have to decide with the other in yourself, identity politics always says the opposite. It says you have to decide as the identity that you're in. And this identity, I mean, it's kind of fatidique, it's kind of fated. It might be embraced. You might choose, to be a woman or whatever it is. But in the end, once you've made that decision, there's a kind of strong pressure on you to decide as. It's always speaking in this language, asa, the language of I'm speaking as this category of person, and other people are not allowed to speak on my behalf if they're not in the same category. All that kind of identity thinking doesn't realize the importance of deciding as the other or thinking as the other. So you can't think on someone else. It's actually a crime within that philosophy to think on behalf of someone else. So politics, in a sense, which is largely about a small group of people deciding what would be good for a larger group of people, in theory anyway, that's what democratic politics is kind of inimical to that way of thinking, the identity politics way of thinking. So I find many aporias in this way of thinking. I just wanted to end with a couple of photos I snapped in a toilet quite close to here. Across the road there's a cafe, and some artist studios next to it, and there's a toilet used by the customers of the cafe, which has posters on the wall, and one of them says, one of them is anti-racist, I guess, and the other is anti-sexist. And one of them says, brown women are not here to be exoticized by you, exoticized in the American spelling. And I found that I had so many problems with this poster, really. First of all, it seems really offensive to call someone a brown woman, especially when you're sitting on a toilet reading the poster. But brown women are not here to be exoticized by you. So it sort of implies they are here for something. This group of people who are grouped only because of a particular shade of skin color, which to me isn't that racism when you say, you can make a general statement. If you can make a general statement about what people of a particular color are not, like they're not here to be X, Y, to do X, Y, or Z, or to have X, Y, and Z done to them, surely it's the same thing as making a statement about what they are here for, or it implies very strongly that they are here for something collectively. I don't really understand that. I don't know quite who's. I suppose you can extrapolate a person that this is another contradiction in this kind of political thinking is that a lot of these statements are correcting flaws in the reader, in the intended audience, the target audience, and yet this is generally it's a philosophy which doesn't forgive. So it simply projects guilt. And I would say in this context that Roland Barthes made me think with something I read in his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in 1977. He said, every discourse which intends to induce guilt is a fascist discourse. Very strong words, and it really made me think, because of course as a puritanical young student, I was very much into the idea of inducing guilt. But what is the point in inducing guilt if you don't think that people can be corrected or improved? And do you embrace someone? Are you really going to embrace someone if they've recalibrated according to the way you've presented things? And is that even going to make them a better person in the first place? If you're looking at a poster saying what brown women are here for, and then, of course, the next word, exoticized. I'm always very suspicious of words like sexualized, exoticized. It implies that some process is happening, a projection is happening onto the person, which the person is not approving, and which is not already endemic in them, and that it's somehow a bad creativity. That if I say, oh, that person is exotic, I'm creating them in an image of what is in my mind about what is exotic, what is domestic, what is interesting. It's a positive term. Orientalism, Edward Said, the whole Orientalism argument. I find it, obviously there's a whole colonial context in which people were exploited and simultaneously exoticized, and that was bad, and we all know that was bad. But at the same time, obviously, exoticization and orientalization, if you want to use those words, I hate the whole idea of orientalization is kind of horrific. But those are obviously on the side of the cosmopolitan world order, which is being rejected since in the last 10 years. And obviously, I'm very much in favour of. I'm also very wary of people. People who are being praised, like the whole thing of microaggressions, where if you're in Japan and people say, oh, you use chopsticks very well for a Westerner, or you speak Japanese very well. These are now considered to be microaggressions by some people who are always looking for the negative component in every statement. And I really was happy to accept any praise for my very basic Japanese or my chopstick skills or whatever. I think it's in itself aggressive to call those microaggressions. And similarly, if I praise someone or I find them attractive and alluring because they're exotic, in other words, outside my ken, and something that's not outside my ken that I'm going to reject because it's outside my ken, but something that I'm going to be drawn towards to learn something new, to refresh my brain with something new, that to me is what exoticism is more about. It's... Of course, nobody is inherently exotic to themselves, or perhaps they are, because actually if you look at the poster, you see that this brown woman is wearing a kind of somewhat ethnic, chunky jewellery. There's almost something Frida Kahlo-ish about her. Another very interesting topic, Frida Kahlo, whose image is now everywhere. She would be astounded to see how all these gift shops in Athens or in Berlin or all over the world now have images of Frida Kahlo. Why? Where has this come from? Even Theresa May wearing a Frida Kahlo bracelet at the Conservative Party conference in Britain. What does this mean? Why this communist woman who was also disabled by a horrific tram accident, why has she become this iconic, my most hated word, figure in the age we're living in? Weirdly enough, Franz Kafka or David Bowie would be the male equivalents. You see David Bowie everywhere, you see Kafka everywhere. No longer Marilyn Monroe and James Dean would have been 20 or 30 years ago. It's now Kafka and Frida Kahlo. So, the decline of the American empire there. But, this idea that that I can decide, according to stigma, I can decide how you're going to see me, I think is just wrong. I don't think that's how society operates. I think we cannot be the brokers of our own of the impressions we make. That is an illusion, and it's to induce guilt about that is a kind of fascism. It's a kind of low-key fascism, where you say I am the only one allowed to define myself, and if I'm not exotic to myself, I can't be exotic to you. It just seems strange. And then we get this further contradiction of the next poster, obviously from the hand of the same artist, who's a very idealistic person, obviously, and wants to improve us morally with these posters. Knowing my gender is not important to treat me with respect. And you have a woman, not a brown woman, she's a white woman, or looks like a woman, we don't know. And the whole point, she has short hair. The whole point of the poster is that it's not important to know her gender. to treat her with respect. Why is it important to know the brown woman's ethnicity, that she's not Caucasian, presumably? So race is still an irreducible category in one poster, but in the other poster, gender is not. And this is, we know the endless minefields of the battlefield of what you can say, racial dolezal and all the rest of it. The current position is you can change gender, but you cannot change race. You can buy into someone else's gender and cross that line, but you're not allowed to cross the racial line. God knows why. I don't know. Is one of them more scientific than the other? I really don't know the state of... this is where you just have to say, okay, boomer. I don't know the state of it. Let me end by saying that I'm totally on board with sensitivity in general. I was walking on a street in Kreuzberg the other day, going to my favourite bookshop in that area, which is called Zabriskie. It's called Zabriskie, and it's a bookshop which deals with countryside issues, but in a very radical way, seeing the countryside as the new topos of radicality and experimental lifestyles and things. So it's got all the Merway philosophy paperbacks and everything there. So I was going there, and this woman was walking along the street, and I happened to notice that she had, an interesting figure, and she was really dressed to exaggerate her figure, and it was, my brain was still not quite, sure why it was interesting to look at her figure, but that just as that was happening, this guy came past on a bicycle and shouted in English at her, "Why don't you eat some food?" And then she snaps back immediately, "Shut up." Just a kind of really vulgar street level kind of interaction that normally I don't see much of that, especially not in a tolerant and cosmopolitan city like Berlin. Why were they both speaking English as well? I'm not really sure. I don't think they knew each other. He was a stranger, and he was just making this remark, this sort of, I guess, body image remark about how she was anorexic, basically implying she was anorexic and she should be more curvy, and he presumably liked women to be more curvy, and she immediately said, justifiably, "Shut up." And I could imagine a scenario in which I would shyly go up and say, "By the way, some of us who don't shout things out at women on the street like how you look," but that would probably be equally bad. That would also be a comment on her body, which came from a stranger. So obviously I'm extremely sensitized to all these issues, and I would never dream of shouting something at a woman on the street, or a man, or a brown person. Even using the term is horrific to me, to say brown person. I'm sure there must be a better term than that. Probably with like a horrible string of LGBTQ, whatever acronym. Treat people with respect, of course, but I suppose the aporias, the kind of in undecidables and the contradictions within those arguments, like whether it's okay to cross racial and not gender barriers, all that stuff fascinates me precisely because it's not knee-jerk thinking. It's not, as I've called it in the past, hymn sheet. It's not the hymn sheet. I mean, we're all handed the hymn sheet, increasingly by institutions. All this stuff is now moved from the left-wing margins, where it was seen as a comfortable substitute for actual Marxist class theory. This is, of course, the main point, I guess, of my objection to identity politics, is not that it's bad to sensitize people about race and gender and all the rest of it. Of course, those are all fine things to do. But that it's been used as a political weapon by the right for 20, 30 years to push Marxist thinking, which is still super relevant to the ownership patterns and the power patterns of dominance, still prevalent today, to the margins, and to make people think me, the sort of individualism plus little fractured tribal groups where there's supposed to be intersectionality, where people, brown people stand up for transgender people, but of course it never happens, or very, very rarely happens, and it's much more schismatic logic of divide and rule. That's been tremendously convenient, and of course since in the last 10 and 20 years that the logic has been so successful, the victim logic, that the actual victims of history, i.e. the proletariat and the working class, in Marxist class terms, have picked up, that being a white male is being oppressed by immigrants, and so it's swung into a right-wing logic. Identity politics is now largely a right-wing and an institutional logic of the institutions covering their asses and trying to make sure that they're seen as being on the right side of history, but also right-wingers saying, I'm discriminated against because I'm a working class, overweight, white male, and Trump is going to come along and save me. So this is where my particular revulsion, it's not just, okay, boomer, it's my particular revulsion as someone schooled in, first of all, existentialism and then Marxist class theory, at the way that those things have been, the momentum of those things, which both had a lot to say for them, has been squandered. That's really all I have to say today.
Open University.